My talk today is essentially based on this little book that I published last year called The Voices of Dissent. In that, I drew on some forms of dissent from the Indian past and tried to link these with modern times, the 20th century and more recent times. In this talk, I shall begin by trying to define what I mean by dissent, fully aware that a definition is required and all kinds of distinctions are required, which I will not go into in detail. I shall then discuss two broad examples of some dissenting ideas from past traditions, the kind of thing that Akhil referred to as my interests of 20, 30, 40 years ago. And in the latter part of the talk, I shall refer to a couple of examples that suggest a link between the comprehension of dissent in past times with some of the ways in which it has been expressed in our own times now. My interest in the subject is, as was said, not a very recent one, nor was it roused primarily by increasing attempts to disallow dissenting opinion in many parts of the world today, including in my own society. I have been writing on the concept of dissent in pre-modern India off and on for the last half century or so. And I see dissent as central to social and cultural change, a centrality that is not new to history in many parts of the world, but a centrality which we historians of India have tended to somewhat ignore. Even the evolving of what we call civilization is a process that has required both dissent and consent in selecting that which is acceptable and that which is to be rejected. But we pay little attention to these as debates, assuming that the process was always constantly consensual. My other purpose was to suggest that there is a continuity in the presence of dissent in various forms through the many centuries. Some characteristic forms can be recognized as having continued to be effective even in present times. And my examples of all this will come, of course, from the Indian subcontinent and the more recent Indian national movement for independence, as well as our subsequent efforts to establish a democratic society. Let me begin then by attempting to define what I mean by dissent. It stems from a difference of opinion or disagreement, but is not arbitrary. It may begin with a minor disagreement, but is recognized as dissent when it refers to a specific issue of some substance that introduces ideas of change in thought and practice. Dissent, therefore, has to be directed to a matter of importance. It can be a form of protest, although protest is generally more organized. Therefore, it is perhaps better to say that dissent can change into or become a form of protest. A distinguishing and significant feature, in fact, a very significant feature, is that dissent is non-violent. Dissent tends to be more vocal in what we call complex societies that bring together a variety of communities following diverse occupations, social rules, belief systems. The greater needs of variant cultures can encourage dissent among some. The process of formulating the requirements of civilization, for instance, did mean selecting ideas and forms of expression, discarding some and furthering others, And this interplay of conformity and dissent cannot be ignored. Dissent encourages the questioning of the world in which we live, and in this process, alternatives can be formulated. Any advance in knowledge requires questioning existing knowledge. Existing explanations sometimes give way to newer and better ones. Otherwise, there is stagnation. And dissent lies at the root of philosophical discourse, as is stated more than once in Indian philosophical discussion. For example, it is said that when making a statement of some consequence, the first step is to state clearly and at length the views of the opponent disagreeing with the proposed argument, the Purva Paksha, as he is called. The second step is the refutation of this argument by the proponent, the Pratipaksha. And finally, there is a debate or a dialogue of the two conflicting views in the hope for a solution, the Siddhanta. This seemingly dialectical method appears to have been practiced in the debates that are referred to as taking place in the royal courts of early times. For instance, the debate between the Shaivas and the Buddhists at the court of Harshavardhana of Kannauj in the 7th century AD. But what this procedure recognizes is the centrality of dissent and the importance of dialogue in the search for a solution when dissent is registered. And this is something I'd like to underline. My examples of dissent from early times are from the religions of pre-modern India. This is not because I think that religion is the primary area where dissent is registered, but because dissent can be seen with greater clarity in every religion. Secondly, my concern is not with dissent in theology, but in some social theories that religions construct, especially those that attract a following through explaining human existence. The explanations were diverse. In modern times, however, attempts were made to bring all religious movements in India, other than the Abrahamic, the Christian and Islam, under a single umbrella. They were seen as multiple manifestations of the same religious doctrine with few dissenting opinions. This is least helpful in understanding them, as not all of them conform, and many disagree. Recognizing the disagreement makes them more visible, and it's the visibility I'm concerned with. In the study of Indian religion, it is often the diverse sects of each that give directions to religions, rather than any monolithic unities that we often ascribe to them. Religious institutions reflect social values and activity. Apart from monasteries and nunneries that are distinct from society, there are institutions such as places of worship or schools of learning that contribute substantially to the actions and ethics of a society. The intersection of religious ideas and social activities, often leading to dissenting opinions and the breaking away of a group, give rise to a new sect. And the multiple sects that sprout around every religion can be expressions of deviance, dissent, or modifications of existing forms. And a sect finds its place somewhere along this spectrum. This is a different pattern from a single monotheism unified by creed and catechism. This pluralism is characteristic of religion in India and may well relate also to its social structure. Let me then illustrate what I'm saying with a couple of examples where dissent has been crucial to the form taken by certain religions. An early articulation of this was in what began as a parallel movement, but dissented significantly from established religion. Vedic Brahmanism was the dominant religious presence in the earlier part of the first millennium BC. Multiple gods were worshipped, but not with icons, but through elaborate sacrificial rituals that consumed much of the wealth that was produced. Its ethics drew on the belief of the reincarnation of the individual soul, and what was later to become the theory of karma. This view met with dissent from what have been broadly termed the Shramana religions, Buddhism in the main, but including Jainism and the Ajivika beliefs. And there were other dissenters too, the Charvak and the Lokayat, who taught an entirely materialist philosophy. They all denied the existence of deities. Consequently, Vedic texts, according to them, could not be taken as revealed and therefore sacred. Forms and locations of worship differed from the Vedic, as did the definition of reincarnation and possible liberation from it. Causality based on reasoning and logic were extremely important in this view. This dissent was only broadly uniform amongst the Shramanas, as they too in turn registered degrees of disagreement. References to the Brahman-Shramana confrontations are explicit in the edicts of the Mauryan king Ashoka. He pleaded for greater tolerance and harmony among them. The period from the Mauryas to the Guptas is one in which the competition is apparent. And it is only in the post-Gupta period that Brahmanism emerges as triumphant. Brahmanical writing refers to these dissenters as Nastika, non-believers, sometimes viewed even as heretics. And the term continued to be used, however, in Sanskrit texts, even as late as the 16th century. And the grammarian Patanjali compares the hostility between the Brahmanas and the Shramans to that between the snake and the mongoose. The term Nastika was not confined to the Shramanas alone. It included all non-believers, all that the Brahmanical thinking were thought were non-believers. Thus, in one 16th century text, the list of Nastikas, non-believers, included the Turushka, a term used for the Turks, for people from Central Asia to begin with, and later on for Muslims. This brings to mind the term kafir. The irony was that the Turushka did believe in deity, but his deity was Allah and not any of the Brahmanical gods. So he was a Nastik, he was a non-believer. The Shramanas were called Nastik because they anyway did not believe in any deity. But Buddhism had its own dissenters. A significant dichotomy separated the Hinayana and the Mahayana sects, interpreting the teachings of the Buddha through multiple differentiated sects. This was also noticeable when Buddhist missionary activity came to the fore in Central Asia and China during the first millennium AD. Here, it met with conditions very different from what it had known in the subcontinent. And this led, therefore, to new questions and answers, and sometimes the founding of new sects. The degree of demarcation from the existing religious order was always variable. The success of a religion depends on its relationship with society and particularly with those in authority, and the elite who provide the patronage and the wherewithal for rituals. A popular following gave it a different kind of support, gave Buddhism a different kind of support. Vedic Brahmanism was a religion of the upper castes and well endowed. The Shramanas had to compete for patronage to establish their social base. Even monastic institutions establishing an alternative system were partially dependent on society. Vedic Brahmanism had a wealthy, prestigious elite support. The popular religion that grew out of these beginnings is what is now being called Puranic Hinduism. It did not formally dissent with Vedic Brahmanism, leaving Brahmanism to its own devices. But Puranic Hinduism incorporated new deities, and it was sects like the Vaishnav, the Shaiv, and the Shaktas whose worship became a part of it. And under these labels, they also mopped up sometimes local cults where such mopping up was useful. The focus was on deity. One among many deities had prominence, and these deities had either been absent or marginal in Vedic worship. Each of the major deities of Puranic Hinduism were maintained by distinctive sects with distinctive texts, such as the Purans. Variations within sects had a large range, and origins, myths, and rituals were recorded, irrespective of whether deities were old or even very recent. And as late as the 20th century, there were new deities being created. Like most religions, Puranic Hinduism had both a gentle side with close human manifestations of deities that the worshipper was comfortable with, as also the more wrathful manifestations of deities. In some forms, they became icons of love, devotion, and compassion, the emotions that guided their worship. And one might ask whether this emphasis drew from the teaching of the Shramanas and of the Bhakti teachers who endorsed this gentler side. Hindu institutions were parallel to but different from those of the Shramanas. Temples replaced chaityas, sometimes literally, and often became places of pilgrimage, thereby attracting commercial activities as well. Icons of the deities were introduced for the first time in the first century, millennium AD, with elaborate rituals, some invented afresh. The monastery was as yet alien to Brahmanism, although something echoing it, like the mutt, became a focus of propagation. And the renouncer, by contrast, the person who became a monk or a nun, continued to have limited links with society. Renunciation was central to shamanism because it was a path to nirvana. It involved dissent from Brahmanical teaching and opting out of social obligations and adopting an alternative monastic lifestyle, focusing on self-liberation. However, it was not self-isolation, since contact with society was necessary. The monk had to collect his food as alms from the people in the vicinity, and his concern about their well-being was required as part of his teaching. Violence, in any case, was totally disallowed. It can be seen as a reciprocal relationship, new and different from what had existed earlier. The ideal, the symbol, the practice of renunciation was implicit in the image of what came to be called popularly as the holy man, the man who meditates, heals, performs miracles, and is generally helpful in misfortunes. he is not the priest. He lives distanced from society, but wanders through villages and towns. And as an icon, this choice could be used effectively, but it could also be abused in giving direction to a community, as often happens. And we always know, keep in mind that people are gullible. The later incoming religions brought new ideas, that is Christianity and Islam. These could either create dissent or be amalgamated into new practices and beliefs. The mixing and the merging of new religious ideas takes shape, for instance, with the coming of various forms of Islam, and I am deliberately using the plural here. We refer to this one single event as starting with the Arabs invading Sindh in the 8th century AD. But in fact, their more effective and long-lasting entry was as traders all down the west coast of India, from Gujarat to Kerala, where they had settlements together with the local people. The religious mix that emerged took the form of new socio-religious sects, all of them different in origin, not conforming to either Puranic Hinduism or Islam. They were mixed. There were sects such as the Bohras, the Khojas, the Mapilas, the Navayats, and such like. The entry of Turks, Afghans, and Mughals into northwestern India followed from the familiarity, the long familiarity that Central Asia had had with northern India. This was through continuing migrations, almost non-stop migrations, and commercial exchanges such as the earlier Silk Route and the later horse trade. The Central Asian presence was momentarily intensified with invasion, but was long-lastingly established with migration and settlement. And the new religion came largely through various Sufi sects with their diverse ideas and practices, some dissenting from the existing religions in India and some borrowing from them. This might explain why the proponents of Krishna Bhakti, devotion to the deity Krishna, the incarnation of Vishnu, were not only devotees such as Vallabhacharya and Surdas, but also came from well-placed Muslim families. Sayyid Ibrahim or Ras Khan and Abdul Rahim Khan-e-Khanan are among those who composed the most exquisite dohas, couplets in Hindi in praise of Krishna and Radha. And these verses are still sung as bandishes in Hindustani classical music. Such devotees were discredited as dissenters by the proponents of established religions, but by both the Qazis, Mullahs, and Maulavis, as well as the Pandits and the Brahmins. So this is really an interesting form of dissent. Bhakti, as a form of religion, had multiple nuclei all over the subcontinent. Their verses were devotional and by implication were often social comments. In our times, these multiple sects have been treated as part of one unified monolithic religious movement. They were actually very diverse and responded to specific local religious requirements. They were not defining a single subcontinental religion. The diversity and the dissent is apparent. Each Bhakti Sant, and forgive me, I prefer to use the term Sant. I don't like the term saint. It's too Christian. I prefer the original Sant. Each Bhakti Sant worshipped one deity of choice in his or her own way, with or without rituals, and often through songs, hymns, and narratives in the local language. There was, therefore, an obvious diversity geared to the local region, although there were a few broad similarities. Deities differed, or the same one was worshipped, but in another way, and of course, in another language. So the nuances differed. Generally, little or no mention is made of other bhakts from different places. Neither Kabir nor Mira, for example, mention the Alvars or Nayanars of the Tamil-speaking region. For some, the worship of the deity was paramount. For others, it was the social message of equality implicit in their devotion. Thus, Ravidas describes his utopia not as a paradise, but as the imagined city of Behrampura, the city where there is no sorrow, Behram, because there is the social equality of all. Social equality is also asserted in the ritual of organized pilgrimages among some sects. Those congregating in devotion are all treated as of equal status, and they break two of the fundamental rules of caste. They eat together, and there is no taboo on touch. For the period of pilgrimage, the rules of the Dharma-shastras do not apply. Even in the religions that preach the equality of all in the eyes of God, social difference was marked and treated as necessary. That is, among Christians and Muslims. The separation between acceptable castes and the unacceptable lower castes and untouchables was in practice universal. Places of worship or areas within the normal places were demarcated and segregated. And we need to inquire into the forms of dissent, although not openly so, that the excluded castes may have adopted. Dissent, therefore, was always present. The Purans continue to treat the Nastikas and the Shramanas, the red-robed ones as they call them, with hostility. The Bhakti tradition incorporates dissent in different measures. The interesting question is, when and how, in each instance, did orthodoxy come to accept or to reject the teaching of the different Bhakti sants, and why? In the second millennium AD, manifestations of Bhakti surfaced in different regions. As long as patronage was available for maintaining temples, mutts, agrahārams, mosques, madrasas, dissent was marginal to the orthodox. But when patronage began to shift to the Bhakti and Sufi teachers, then the Brahmins and the mullahs both would have been rather anxious about their own future. Patronage created an almost predictable dichotomy. Wealthy patrons, royalty, landowners, traders, and such like contributed the wherewithal for building the institutions for established sects. But when the following of dissenting sects increased, either through their teaching or their belief in the miraculous powers of the sons, then their evident popularity would have attracted political authority, as it did. Politics brought in further patronage or brought in disapproval. The dargahs and the khanqahs of the Sufis and the Bhakti cult centers such as Pandharpur and Vrindavan flourished. Those without patronage, however, became part of the collective memory. Let me repeat that dissent was always present as an undercurrent in the ideas and movements associated with many aspects of life. Barring the Orthodox religion at all social levels was malleable. and adjusted to social and political change, as is evident from the histories of most sects. This perhaps explains the mutations and reformulations of religions in colonial times. The presence of dissent needs greater recognition when historical change occurs. What have been called socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century, Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, Prarthana Samaj, and such like, were inevitably imprinted with some colonial ideas. They questioned Brahmana orthodoxy, but with the intention of suggesting reform rather than any heterodox replacement. The Arya Samaj, for instance, reconstructed Vedic society as a utopia and propagated returning to Vedic values and practices. Calls to return to tradition often draw on a virtually invented tradition in accord with the ideological and social needs of present times. Among these was nationalism, speaking for the emergence of a new socio-political structure, a nation state, and a different society. Some advocated a new utopia, that of a secular democratic state. Others reversed this and culled up a state identified with the majority religion as its significant feature. Democratic nationalism was a protest against colonial rule, articulated in many ways of dissent and opposition to this rule. The degree of dissent could convert it into a manifestation of social protest. The form it took in the early 20th century was seemingly new to the anti-colonial secular national movement for independence. The question is, was this dissent entirely new? The protest, incorporating degrees of dissent, attracted a large number of people who became supporters of secular nationalism. This nationalism was distinct from the nascent but growing religious nationalisms, the Muslim and the Hindu. These latter had a different agenda and teleology. Their intention was to establish religious majoritarian states, the Islamic in Pakistan, and the possibly imminent Hindu Rashtra. These two religious nationalisms took their cue from the colonial understanding of Indian history and consequently had a disinterest in confronting colonial power. Religious nationalism cannot accommodate democracy. It is conflictual. The secular national movement, envisaging a democratic nation state, took forward some of the ideas of dissent, only some, as had been formulated in earlier times. These were more in keeping with the requirements of groups protesting against colonial rule. A few earlier forms of dissent surfaced again. And among them, the two I want to mention were the two that were adapted by Gandhi as among his forms of protest. One was the dharna, and the other was what he called satyagraha. How conscious he was of adapting earlier forms is something that is being currently researched. Mine is just a hint, you might say, a slightly wild idea that grazed through my mind. What I am arguing in this discussion of dissent in early India is that we should look more closely at the links between the past and the present. One among the many reasons for the success of these two forms of protest in the 20th century may have been that the Indian people were familiar with these forms as a recognized articulation of dissent. These were not entirely new forms of dissent. Dharna was known and practiced in some of the smaller kingdoms, especially in parts of Western India. Dissatisfied subjects would express their disagreement with the ruler through a dharna. This involved convincing the bard, the charan or the bhat as he was called, that the popular dissatisfaction was justified. If convinced, the bard would then place himself at the threshold of the palace and declare that he would undergo a fast unto death until the ruler reconsidered his decision. Why was the bard so important? We today pay no attention to such figures in our society. But the bard maintained the genealogy and the narrative of the ruling family. This legitimized dynastic claims to high status. The genealogy was often the skeleton of the royal narrative, and the bard maintained his independence by not becoming an officer of the state. In other words, he was the independent legitimizer of power. The bard was no ordinary person, even if low in caste. In his capacity of being a royal emissary, he was inviolable. Should the hunger strike result in his death, it would be taken as a huge stigma on the ruler, justifying his removal. And the resort to such a fast was a known and accepted political weapon in these kingdoms. Where Gandhi resorts to fasts to make a political demand, either from the colonial power or from the competing nationalisms, the religious nationalisms, he is projected as an independent person with the stature of a Mahatma, literally a great soul. In effect, very similar to the holy man that I was talking about. He takes it upon himself to speak for the people of India in supporting their demand for freedom or to live in harmony, else he will lose his life. As one symbolizing dissent, he needed the stature to take this position. This was recognized both by the Indian people and by the colonial power, directly or indirectly. But Gandhi's major formulation of a method of dissent, which became associated with him, was what he called satyagraha, literally holding the truth. The creation of this form of dissent drew partly and perhaps subconsciously from a tradition of dissent that prevailed in the many cultures of India and which I have referred to earlier. Thus, I would argue that it was a form of dissent that evoked older practices in a modern situation. It can be called dissent since it had characteristics familiar to the Indian people and recalled by the continuing presence of the renouncers, the bhakti sants, the yogis, the peers, the fakirs, and other categories of what one may call today holy men and opters out. The term, the naked fakir, evoked unintentionally the established tradition of dissenters. All of these claimed the right to deny their consent to what existed if they so wished. These characteristics are evident. Dissent is not just disagreement. Its intention has an objective. The objective in South Africa was not identical with the later one in India. Nevertheless, dissent is directed towards political and social change and ensuring the well-being of people. This makes it reminiscent of the aims of the earlier dissenters, the Shramanas and the Bhakti Sants. It does not merely advocate a return to a vague fantasy of a golden age, it defines that age, even if differently. Nonviolence is a marked component, hence its description as passive resistance and civil disobedience. It endorses a dialogue between opposite opinions in order to arrive at a solution reminiscent of the method suggested in early times for solving opposing arguments. It speaks to and includes all and every citizen of a nation, men and women. It is specifically not majoritarianism. Implicit in its thinking is the need for the foundation of the society to be democratic. It is irrespective of religion, of caste, of status. Women are encouraged to participate. The presence of women is particularly striking, as indeed it was in the earlier movements of dissent. It was the Shramanas that permitted women to take up renunciation as nuns, admittedly after some debate and persuasion. Women sants such as Andal, Meera, Laldev were accepted as teachers. It is often forgotten that the confined condition of women, as advocated in the Dharmashastra texts, is not what was advocated in all texts and practices in past times. Many were different, whatever the degree of difference. The national movement did not necessarily treat all women as liberated citizens. Nevertheless, there were some activities in which it was thought that women could be more active and effective, such as the well-known ones, picketing liquor shops and objecting to mill-made cloth. It was the realization that if dissent is to be effective as passive resistance, it must be the voice of both men and women. And the salt satyagraha was one such. It would be worth knowing in greater detail how such events were given form, who participated, and why, apart from the call of, and why they participated, apart from the call of the Mahatma. It is equally important to ascertain the reaction of the participants to the essential meaning of such activities. After 1947, passive resistance on any subcontinental scale has not been used when disagreeing with the laws of any government. Nevertheless, sporadic expressions of dissent have been and can become the reason for arrest, as has happened earlier under colonial governance and is also happening more recently. What comes to mind, however, are the two recent events of Shaheen Bagh and the farmers' protest in the vicinity of Delhi. Shaheen Bagh and other protests linked to it in other cities had a larger component of women and of students expressing their opposition to the new law, the Citizen Amendment Act of the government, debarring some categories of people from citizenship. The overwhelming presence of women was particularly striking. It was almost a women's movement. The farmers' protest was again against newly formulated laws on agricultural produce. The protesters were non-violent in both cases, demanding a dialogue on the recently passed laws and their future. This also ties into the bigger question inherent to decisions in a democracy as to how these laws were being received by those most closely affected by them. In a democratic society, their voice has also to be heard. Dissenting views today have a new dimension. We are no longer a colony ruled by a colonizer in, for example, the Indian subcontinent. We have been aspiring to function, in India at least, as a nation state that is a secular democracy, as are many others in the world. In this context, protests can also be viewed as a comment on the questions being raised in discussions in many, many places. Does elected representation suffice in conveying what people want? And these are discussions that I think affect the whole idea of democracy. Inevitably, the wider aspects of democracy have to be discussed, such as additional ways of debating disagreements and finding solutions to the problems that we are facing today. How, for example, can we strengthen the institutions that protect democracy? Can the three constitutional pillars that are always spoken of, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, be made more secure and autonomous, especially as guardians of the rights of citizens? Such questions are pertinent in the context of how democracy should function now and in the future. The failures in democratic functioning in the past century, in some parts of Europe and Asia that we are all familiar with, resulted in disasters for humanity, and the repetition of that pattern is not called for. One may ask as to what Gandhi would have said to recent forms of passive resistance. A distinction between the colonial situation and that in an independent nation state should be evident when it comes to the role of dissent. The passive resistance of Gandhi asserted dissent and evolved into protest. The legitimacy of such forms in a democratic nation state are better viewed as segments of public opinion. In some polities across the world today, dissent is being treated as an anti-national act. Yet, it is well established that the pivot of a liberal secular democracy is a wide-ranging debate prior to decisions, which has to come to terms with dissenting views. Let me repeat once again what our elders, ancients, philosophers maintained many years ago. There can be no Siddhanta solution if the views of the Purva Paksha, the opponent, are silenced by the Pratipaksha, the proponent. It is imperative that we understand the historical centrality of dissent. It was and is essential to the formulating of cultures everywhere and to establishing democratic forms and norms. We have to recognize the inevitability of dissent in the events, many of the events that have shaped history and that are now shaping the present. Thank you.